The Quiet Arm. When the Galactic Council was young, it had no throne, no fleet, and no taxes. It had a hall. That was how Ambassador Helen Okonkwo of Earth liked to describe it centuries later when people asked what the founders had intended. Not a government, not an authority, a hall, a place where frightened powers could meet before fear turned to war. In the beginning, that had been enough. The first species to gather there were not friends. They were survivors. The galactic core had birthed old civilizations in crowded constellations where bright stars sat close together and transit lanes crossed like woven wire. Resources were rich, colonies numerous, borders confused. It had been inevitable that they would collide. The first interstellar wars had not been wars of extermination. They had been worse in a way. Wars of misunderstanding, pride, and escalating retaliation carried across 100 systems before anyone understood the scale of what they had begun. By the time the founders assembled, 7 major civilizations had burned fleets they could not replace and worlds they would never forget. Humanity had been the youngest of them. That was not why the others underestimated them. Youth in those days still meant possibility. The Council founders underestimated humanity because Earth lay in the Orion Arm, far from the glittering density of the core. On early maps, the arm was a thin curl of stars, barely worth notation, a bright seam at the galaxy's edge. Survey data was sparse. Transit routes were long. Several respected astronomer castes among the elder species held, with total confidence and very little evidence, that spiral arms so far from the central bulge were diluted, poor in metals, and strategically trivial. Earth's delegates never worked very hard to correct them. When the first council census was taken, humanity reported honestly enough. One homeworld, several nearby colonies, a respectable industrial base, a capable fleet for local defense, modest ambitions, diplomatic intent. It was all true. It was also incomplete in the way all truths become incomplete when spoken to people who stop asking questions the moment they hear what they expected. The human delegates noticed this quickly. So did 2 of the other founding species. The Eller were long-boned, silver-skinned beings whose cities had once wrapped whole moons in lattices of light. They had a reputation for abstraction, for thinking on scales so large that younger species found them cold. They were not cold. They were careful. They had survived the core wars by understanding that any power visible enough to attract awe was visible enough to attract fear. The Sarth preferred silence to speeches and geometry to ceremony. Their fleets had ended 3 wars not by spectacular victories, but by arriving exactly where they needed to be, with exactly the right force, every time. Their navigators said spacetime had a grammar if one listened patiently enough. Most species treated that as mysticism, until they found Sarth task groups already waiting on their flanks. The humans, the Eller, and the Sarth were never a formal block in the first council, but they understood each other almost immediately. The old hall on Council Station had no assigned seating, but the 3 civilizations almost always ended up near one another anyway. "Your arm is empty," one of the core magnates told Helen Okonkwo after a session on trade lanes, his translator frills bright with condescension. "A blessing, perhaps. Quiet lives in quiet places." Helen smiled the way humans smiled when they had learned something useful. "We are very fond of quiet," she said. That became a policy, though no one announced it as one. The council remained what it had been designed to be for several ages. It mediated disputes, recorded treaties, standardized beacons, coordinated relief after stellar disasters, and provided a place where angry ambassadors could shout at one another instead of ordering bombardments. It was valuable, even noble in the rough, practical way institutions sometimes are when nobody has yet discovered how profitable control can be. Humanity helped build that council. Then humanity went home and got very busy. The Orion Arm was not empty. It was not poor. It was not even particularly remote, once one stopped using core transit geometry as the measure of all things. What it lacked in density, it made up for in room. Broad reaches of stable systems lay separated by navigable dark, rich in asteroids, cometary shells, and young stars whose planetary disks had never been harvested. There were metal-rich belts the size of empires. There were habitable worlds that no one had claimed because no one had bothered looking. There were stars suitable for engineering on scales, the core species considered extravagant because they had never had enough unclaimed space to think extravagantly. Human scouts found them. Human colony fleets followed. At first the expansion looked ordinary enough. Domed settlements, mining stations, modular habitats, fuel depots on lonely rocks. Then came the industrial swarms. Then orbital foundries. Then whole belts turned into machine ecologies that chewed stone and exhaled ships, habitats, and mirrors. Human civilization did what it had always done best. It multiplied by making the next outpost easier to build than the last. The Eller drifted outward more slowly. Their migration looked, to any outsider who glimpsed pieces of it, like retreat. They decommissioned famous core installations. They sold heritage holdings. They moved archives and fabrication seeds into the arm under the guise of research projects and energy prospecting. Privately, their senior planners had concluded that the Council's peace would not last forever, because no peace built by frightened empires ever did. If there was to be another age of coercion, they preferred to meet it under stars with room to maneuver. The Sarth followed on lanes no one else charted properly. They established listening arrays in the dark between systems, refit barren moons into navigation sanctuaries, and seeded the arm with beacon webs so subtle that even later, when enemies crossed among them, they would not know they were there. Where humans built volume and the Eller built depth, the Sarth built awareness. For a long time, the three powers remained separate, though intertwined. Human contractors raised Eller stations. Eller energy design turned marginal human colonies into industrial anchors. Sarth navigation cut months from freight passages and years from military redeployment plans. There were marriages and trade compacts and shared universities. There were arguments, too, fierce ones, because alliances made of living peoples always argue. But there was also a growing recognition that the farther they expanded from the Council's attention, the less any of them needed to pretend that the core was the center of the galaxy. Centuries passed, then more. On Council registers, humanity remained a middling founding civilization with quaint provincial habits. The Eller were respected elders whose greatest works were said to lie behind them. The Sarth were reclusive and useful when route calculations were needed. Their delegations remained present. Their embassies paid dues. Their representatives spoke rarely but well. Meanwhile, in the Orion Arm, worlds multiplied beyond easy counting. There were agricultural planets under open skies and manufactured habitats strung around brown dwarfs in glittering chains. There were star-lifting platforms hidden in coronas, drawing matter in controlled ribbons for fuel and heavy elements. There were orbitals so large they developed districts, dialects, and weather. There were shipyards, but shipyards tucked inside hollowed asteroids, masked with thermal veils, or distributed across a million innocuous signatures rather than one grand silhouette. There were fleets, but fleets parked in deep black reservoirs between stars. Crews rotated through habitats with civilian designations. Maintenance done by layers of automated industry no outsider ever audited. The arm did not merely grow, it learned how to look uninteresting. That habit came partly from prudence and partly from temperament. Humans had discovered over several thousand years of social experience that declaring oneself important attracted committees. It also attracted moralists, investors, raiders, missionaries, regulators, and fools with schemes. The Eller agreed on the basis of longer and sharper memory. The Sarth did not phrase it that way, but their strategic literature contained a proverb that humans translated loosely as, "The eye slides from what offers it no edges." So they became smooth. Trade with the core continued, but selectively. Exports left through intermediaries or processing chains that hid origin volume. High technologies were shared outward only when it served some local or scientific purpose. Military demonstrations were avoided almost pathologically. Human ships in council space were neat, efficient, and thoroughly unimpressive. Eller delegations cultivated an air of mild decline. Sarth flotillas never arrived in numbers sufficient to make anyone revise old assumptions. Why would the core look harder? The Orion arm sat where it always had, on the edge of maps drawn by people who thought edges mattered more than contents. In the early ages of expansion, the Council's change was subtle enough that many missed it. New species joined in waves. Some came from the inner disk, some from neighboring arms, some from hidden pockets the original founders had never known. This was, on its face, a triumph. More voices, more treaties, more exchange. The old hall became a campus, then a ring, then a city of administration and translation towers wrapped around the original chamber like coral around old stone. But growth changed incentives. A body designed to mediate between 7 major powers behaved differently when it had 112 members, then 300, then nearly 1,000 recognized civilizations and dependent polities. Disputes became constant. Trade standards turned from convenience into leverage. Humanitarian missions needed logistics. Logistics needed budgets. Budgets needed enforcement. Enforcement needed doctrine. And doctrine always developed believers. Some of the newer member states found the founders' loose philosophy frustrating. A forum, they argued, was too weak. Mediation without binding authority merely allowed large powers to bully small ones behind the polite veil of sovereignty. Shared rules should be mandatory. Arbitration should be binding. Certain categories of weaponry should be prohibited and inspected. Colonization rights should be registered centrally. Transit corridors should be taxed for common security. A standing fleet should exist, accountable not to any one civilization but to the Council itself. There was sense in some of it. That was what made the shift dangerous. Human delegates often voted for narrow reforms and against broad authority. So did the Eller. So did the Sarth. Though when the Sarth opposed a measure, their objections tended to be so precise that they could fence a proposal down to its hidden assumptions in a matter of minutes. The new blocks learned to dislike them. Your position presumes a world that no longer exists, said Councillor Marat of the Taller Union during one famous debate on inspection rights. The Taller had come late to the Council, but rose quickly through administrative mastery and ideological certainty. They were tall, faceted beings whose voices carried like tuned glass, and whose politics held that harmony was not discovered, but imposed. A galaxy of this scale cannot survive on voluntary restraint. The human representative, Jonah Alvarez of Luna Assembly, folded his hands and replied with infuriating calm. It survived its first age of peace that way. Because the great powers chose peace. Yes. Marat's facets flashed blue-white, and if they choose otherwise, then no clause you pass in this chamber will stop them, Alvarez said. Only the balance of consequences will. Murmurs filled the hall. Many heard that as cynicism. Some heard it as threat. The founders heard it as observation. Other species rose with the Taller. The Vesk Combine offered military backing to any expansion of council enforcement. The Combine had once been a mercantile civilization and had become, by increments too profitable to resist, the armorers and carriers of council authority. Their admirals liked order because order required fleets. Their industrial cartels liked order because certified fleets required approved suppliers. Then there were the hierarchy of Dren, old in title but newly ascendant, who clothed dominance in language of civilizational uplift. To them, peripheral regions and independent holdouts were not simply stubborn. They were immature. Every debate with Dren delegates eventually arrived at the same conclusion. Those who rejected centralized guidance were selfishly endangering everyone else. That was when humanity began preparing not merely to stay quiet, but to leave. The Eller had considered departure for almost a century before they admitted it publicly even to their closest allies. The Sarth had contingency plans older than some council species. Humans, characteristically, argued longer than either of them, because humans could find moral significance in every procedural detail, and because many still loved the old council for what it had once been. They held summits in the Orion Arm under stars no core census had ever named. On Ganymede Reborn, beneath a dome of transparent diamond over an ocean engineered from imported comet ice, human ministers and assembly delegates met Eller system stewards in towers grown from metallic crystal. Sarth navigators joined by projection from ships that never seemed to dock in the same place twice. They debated law, trade access, migration guarantees, military obligations, and whether leaving the council would itself accelerate the transformation they feared. At last, an old Eller Systems architect named Teth Avar said what others had circled for months. "The institution we helped build is gone," Teth said. "Its shell remains, its symbols remain, its young still believe in it sincerely, but its incentives no longer favor restraint. It seeks jurisdiction because it can. It will seek more because it already has some. We are not choosing between loyalty and departure. We are choosing between departure now and conflict later under worse terms." The human room was silent for a while. Then Admiral Lion Ortega, speaking for the defense coordination of the Orion settlements, asked the question humans always asked eventually. "If we go," she said, "do we go alone?" Sarth navigator Marshal Issen answered in the flat cadence of his species, "No." That mattered. What followed became known later as the fracture session, though nothing shattered visibly at first. There was no dramatic storming out, no threats, no raised weapons in the council chamber. The founders had too much dignity for theater and too much experience for improvisation. They submitted notice through the existing charter mechanisms, because the old charter, ironically, still preserved the right of voluntary withdrawal from cooperative obligations. That clause had been considered quaint by later generations. Nobody had imagined major powers would actually use it. Humanity, the Eller continuance, and the Sarth conquered all invoked it on the same day. A fourth civilization, the Nari assemblages, a smaller but highly capable polity of distributed machine biological minds that had never trusted centralization, withdrew with them after quiet consultation. The Nari had only been minor players in council politics, but in engineering and information stewardship they were formidable. Their inclusion would matter later, though the council barely noticed at the time. The formal statement delivered jointly was simple. The council had exceeded the mandate of its founding purpose. It had transformed from a forum for sovereign civilizations into an authority claiming powers never granted by the original charter. The withdrawing members would honor existing peaceful treaties, maintain open diplomatic channels, and continue civilian trade under mutually negotiated terms. They would not, however, submit to compulsory inspection, centralized jurisdiction, or enforcement fleets. Councillor Marat of the Taller called it reckless provincialism. The Vesk delegates called it grandstanding by declining powers. A Drin prelate called it a temporary tantrum by civilizations unable to adapt to maturity. Jonah Alvarez listened to all of it with the expression of a man hearing weather reports from very far away. The thing that most enraged the dominant blocs was not the withdrawal itself. It was the composure. The founders did not plead. They did not threaten. They did not justify themselves beyond the statement. They simply left. In the years immediately after, the council expected consequences to teach the defectors humility. None came. Trade from the Orion Arm dipped only slightly, then reorganized through new channels. Scientific exchanges continued with universities and institutes willing to remain genuinely independent. Smaller member states still sent students outward because the human, Eller, and Nari institutions were too useful to ignore. Sarth navigation consultancies remained quietly indispensable in regions where council cartography was weak. The withdrawing civilizations did not fragment. They did not descend into border wars. They did not come back asking for special terms. Instead, beyond the council's reach, they built something patient. They never gave it a grand name at first. Humans proposed several and mistrusted all of them. The Eller disliked labels that would harden into ideology. The Sarth preferred function to identity. The Nari argued that names were compression artifacts and should not be fetishized. In practice, though, agreements accumulated, and a thing made of agreements eventually becomes real whether anyone celebrates it or not. Common transit protocols, shared defense commitments, emergency mutual aid, coordinated standards for habitats, medicine, manufacturing, and interspecies law, a joint academy for diplomacy, an arbitration framework with no central executive but broad respect because its decisions were transparent and none of its members wanted the alternative. Open borders for citizens among member systems with local autonomy preserved. Strategic planning conducted in layered councils where no one species could command the others, but all could contribute. After 3 centuries of operation, traders from outside began calling it the Compact because forms needed somewhere to write a destination authority. The name stuck. Eventually, even its members used it. The Orion Compact did not resemble an empire. It resembled a web. Humans were its mass. By population and industrial output, they were the largest component by an absurd margin. They had spread through the arm with the relentless adaptability that once covered a single planet and later 1,000 worlds. Human political organization was a maddening patchwork to outside observers. Commonwealths, unions, republics, habitat leagues, chartered cooperatives, city swarms, family fleets, academic protectorates, and sovereign worlds that were sovereign in practice, only until pirates, plagues, or wars reminded them why larger structures existed. Yet across that diversity ran shared channels of logistics and defense so deep that a famine on one fringe world could trigger cargo reroutings from 600 systems before local governors finished arguing about jurisdiction. The Eller became the Compact's great energy and habitat designers. They preferred permanence and elegance, and given enough time they produced both at stellar scales. They built sun-laced grids hidden within ordinary system architecture, power reservoirs dispersed across civilian infrastructure, and habitats whose mass, shielding, and internal redundancies made them nearly impossible to kill without turning whole planets to slag. Their work was never flashy. It was too integrated for that. A station looked like a station until war came, and then one discovered that its shell concealed field projectors, distributed reactors, repair swarms, and enough reserve power to support a fleet action. The Sarth became the nervous system. They mapped currents through real space and slipspace with a precision council navies would have considered impossible. They designed sensor meshes in which asteroids, fuel buoys, weather satellites, and even migratory drone flocks could all become eyes under the right protocols. Their admirals disliked the word ambush because it implied secrecy without structure. What the Sarth practiced was environmental certainty. They wanted to know where every meaningful object in a battle space might be hours before it mattered. The Nari became the Compact's memory and quiet miracle workers. Their distributed cognition made them unmatched at archival continuity, industrial process optimization, and systems integration. When humans wanted a habitat to look like a sleepy refinery, while hiding production numbers fit for a shipyard, Nari masking algorithms made the telemetry believable. When Eller energy nets needed to route around civilian life so completely that even local residents forgot where the true load-bearing nodes lay, the Nari modeled it. When Sarth planners wanted decoy traffic patterns, convincing enough to satisfy hostile analytics for centuries, the Nari built living false histories around them. The Compact was not hiding because it was weak. It was hiding because being underestimated is one of the most powerful strategic positions in the universe. The Council, meanwhile, continued to evolve in exactly the direction the founders had feared. Compliance inspections became standard, transit duties expanded, a permanent peacekeeping command became a standing enforcement arm. Some of its work remained genuinely useful. Piracy declined in police sectors. Certain prohibited weapon classes were contained. Some predatory regional powers were checked. These successes gave cover to every subsequent expansion of jurisdiction. Each crisis justified a little more reach. Each increase in reach generated a need for additional oversight. Each layer of oversight found reasons to perpetuate itself. By the time 500 years had passed since the fracture session, a generation had grown up in the core for whom the Pre-Authority Council was almost mythological. To them, the Orion Arm was not threatening. It was embarrassing. A patch of holdout civilizations whose romantic attachment to sovereignty made them useful examples in administrative lectures. Then came the Farron secessions, and with them the political moment that finally turned embarrassment into target. The Farron were not part of the compact. They were a mid-tier council member state spread across 42 systems near a trade corridor. When council regulators attempted to nationalize their gate infrastructure after a budget crisis, the Farron resisted. The standoff turned ugly. Enforcement flotillas were dispatched. Broadcasts of council marines seizing control spines on Farron stations circulated everywhere. Though the council ultimately prevailed, the cost in legitimacy was severe. Other member states began muttering about charter limits, old rights, and local autonomy. In response, the dominant bloc did what centralizing blocs throughout history almost always do when their authority is questioned. They looked for an external demonstration. The Orion Compact was ideal: old defectors, remote, politically unfashionable, supposedly weak. If the Council could compel even symbolic compliance from the founders who had walked away, every doubter in the core would get the message. By then Councillor Merritt was dead, but her school remained. The Taller Consensus guided much of the administrative doctrine behind expansion. The Vesk Combine supplied hulls and guns. The hierarchy of Drin provided the moral language in which coercion could be called stewardship. Together with lesser-aligned states, they pushed through authorization for a compliance expedition to the Orion Arm. Officially, it was not an invasion. Officially, it was a mission to re-establish lawful oversight, inspect military capacities for prohibited classes, and negotiate the reintegration of withdrawn founders into updated council structures for the security of all. Unofficially, everyone understood what it was. The fleet assembled over Vesk Prime in ceremonial brilliance. Journalists were invited. Admirals gave statements about proportionate enforcement and historical responsibility. Analysts on council feeds spoke confidently about outdated frontier powers and the psychological importance of showing firmness early. Some noted the old founders, prestige, and suggested a gentle hand. Others laughed. How much resistance could come from civilizations that had chosen obscurity for centuries? Grand Marshal Seja, Var commanded the expedition. Var was Vesk, broad-shelled and iron-sure, a career officer whose major flaw was not stupidity but professional contempt. He had spent his life dealing with smaller powers who bluffed until shown the true asymmetry between local bravado and industrialized force. In briefing rooms, he referred to the Orion Compact as the Antiquarians. "You are not sailing to war," he told his officers before departure. "You are carrying reality to those who have avoided it." No one in the room contradicted him, because all the data confirmed his view. Council intelligence on the Orion Arm was extensive in quantity and poor in quality. There were records of known human colonies, old Eller research stations, Sarth navigation monasteries, Nari archive habitats. There were trade estimates, census approximations, and sensor logs from passing merchants. They described a broad but sparse region, economically active in pockets, technologically competent but unexceptional, with no signs of concentrated military infrastructure. Some analysts noted gaps and anomalies, inexplicably low thermal output from supposedly inhabited systems, suspiciously regular freight losses into local distribution, and improbably efficient supply chains for minor colonies. These concerns were filed, cross-referenced, and eventually dismissed under the assumption that the outer arm simply had eccentric accounting conventions and weaker telemetry standards. The compact had written most of those conventions for precisely that reason. As the expedition departed the dense lanes of the core and moved outward, observers expected some visible increase in readiness. Instead, the farther they traveled, the more the galaxy seemed to dissolve. Stars spread apart, traffic thinned, council relays became less frequent, systems appeared where scans showed little more than a fuel station, a mining lattice, perhaps a habitat ring around a moon. Human and Eller traffic existed, yes, but at civilian levels. Sarth signatures flickered at the edges and vanished before pursuit vectors could fix them. Nari nodes showed up as archival depots and weather monitors. Nothing looked like the heartland of a serious power. The first weeks in the arm deepened Var's confidence. His scouts entered system after system and found exactly what old prejudice had promised them. Quiet stars, modest populations, sparse visible infrastructure, local traffic light enough that a council formation crossing the ecliptic practically dominated the sky. There were no monumental shipyards wrapped around suns, no obvious mobilization depots, no fortress worlds bristling with batteries, no endless merchant swarms suggesting industrial density. In some systems, there were barely any thermal blooms beyond ordinary civilian life. Captain Sen Ol of the reconnaissance screen submitted a cautious memo after the seventh survey jump. He was taller, analytically severe, and less comfortable with easy assumptions than his superiors. The memo noted that several apparently minor colonies showed better maintenance than their traffic should support, and that multiple systems had oddly optimized energy signatures, as if large loads were being dispersed to avoid concentration. He also observed that local beacon architecture implied route density higher than visible shipping would justify. Var read the memo, marked it for review, and said to his staff, "The frontier uses efficient engineering. Astonishing." They laughed. In another system, a sensor officer remarked that a small human settlement on a moon had the kind of shielding quality usually seen only in strategic infrastructure. The local commander concluded that frontier populations must harden everything because replacement capacity was low. That explanation went into the brief. A week later they passed what appeared to be an Eller agricultural installation spread in graceful arcs around a red giant. One of the expedition's civilian analysts wondered aloud why a simple agri-complex would need such extensive power buffering. Another analyst answered that perhaps the aging Eller simply never forgot how to overbuild. This explanation also went into the brief. Each quiet system reinforced the next conclusion. The Orion compact was diffuse, poorly concentrated, respectably resilient perhaps, but strategically hollow. If there was power here, it was the power of distance and stubbornness, not fleet capacity. That was exactly what the compact had intended them to see. The real shipyards were buried in dark reservoirs around failed stars and inside minor planets whose emission profiles were tuned to geological normalcy. The real fleet anchorages lay in the cold between systems, where magnetic shadows and layered decoys swallowed active signatures. The real trade volume moved through schedules, vectors, and channels the Council did not know to watch, often piggybacking on civilian patterns so broad and distributed that no one sensor picture ever revealed scale. The real energy infrastructure was woven into ordinary life so intimately that a habitat district, a weather net, and a civilian transit ring could all become part of a defense grid in minutes. Looking for banners and parade grounds, the Council saw emptiness. Captain Sen Ol remained uneasy. He asked permission to conduct deeper gravimetric sweeps on several apparently unimportant systems. Permission was denied because the expedition timetable prioritized political momentum over exhaustive survey. Another scout reported brief mass shadows in a remote transit corridor, consistent with large objects under thermal masking. The report was logged as likely false returns from dust and magnetics. By the time the fleet neared the inhabited volume around Sol's outer relations and the neighboring compact systems, Var had convinced himself that speed was the wisest course. A hard demonstration now, before the defectors realized what pressure they were under, would end things neatly. The first official communication arrived in the Ilian corridor, near a system whose outward face consisted of 3 sleepy habitats, a fuel ring, and a moonside mining cooperative. The transmission came on open council bands, in standard diplomatic protocol, from 3 sources simultaneously. One signal originated from a Terran relay with no visible escort, another from an Eller station so ordinary the expedition had almost ignored it, the third from somewhere the Sarth politely declined to specify. The image that appeared on Var's flagship bridge was a composite frame of all 3 species. The human speaker was an older woman in a dark civilian jacket, gray at the temples, expression calm. The Eller representative stood beside her, silver skin reflecting instrument light like water under stars. The Sarth appeared as a narrow figure half in shadow, eyes unreadable. "I am Secretary Mara Ellison," the human said, "speaking for the Compact Coordination Council. With me are Steward Teth Sen of the Eller Continuance and Navigator Marshal Issen of the Sarth Concord. Your fleet has entered sovereign space under compact administration. You are instructed to halt advance and declare intent." Var gave the sort of smile used by officers who believe they are being patient with history. "I am Grand Marshal Seja Var of the Galactic Council Compliance Expedition. We are here under lawful authority to conduct inspections and negotiate the orderly restoration of charter obligations by withdrawn member civilizations." "The Council has no authority here," Mara Ellison said. "That question was settled generations ago." "Not to our satisfaction," Var replied. "Your withdrawal predates the modern charter framework." "The modern charter framework," said the Eller steward, "has no standing over non-signatories." Var ignored him. "You will submit inspection teams and receive council envoys for reintegration talks. Resistance will be viewed as hostile obstruction." The Sarth navigator tilted his head the slightest degree. "You are being offered safe withdrawal." "We are offering you civilization." Mara Ellison's expression did not change. "Grand Marshal, you entered this arm because for a very long time we preferred to be left alone. Do not mistake preference for incapacity." Var had heard versions of this from minor powers before. It was almost comforting. "Secretary," he said, "if incapacity were not the issue, you would have shown capacity already." The channel held silence for a heartbeat. Then the human woman nodded once, as if a private uncertainty had been resolved. "Understood," she said. "This transmission will be archived as notice refused. Withdraw now and no further action follows. Advance beyond the Ilian demarcation and you will be considered an invading force." The channel closed. On the bridge, one of Var's senior staff let out a soft, dismissive huff. "They are bluffing," she said. "They have to bluff," said another. Captain Sen Ol did not speak. Var ordered the expedition onward. The first strike was meant to be surgical. A demonstration, not slaughter. Council doctrine recommended disabling visible command and control nodes, interdicting transit, and seizing 1 or 2 inhabited stations as leverage. In this case, the target was a seemingly minor transit and communications complex near the Keld Gate, a structure the expedition believed coordinated local shipping for several neighboring systems. The fleet emerged in attack posture. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the stars changed. Not literally. Later, survivors would argue about the phrasing, but everyone knew what they meant. A battle space that had seemed broad, quiet, and mostly empty suddenly acquired shape. Contacts bloomed across tactical displays too fast for human speech or VESC code to keep pace. Gravitic shadows unfolded from the black between planets. Thermal ghosts sharpened into warships in layers, near and far, above and below the fleet's assumed plane. Civilian beacons rewrote themselves into targeting grids. The ordinary transit ring around the minor, communications, complex lit, with power flowing through channels no council scan had identified. Stations, moons, and free orbit platforms that had looked separate and harmless resolved into a single integrated defense web. Captain Sen-Ul whispered to no one and everyone there. The first compact volleys were not spectacular. They were efficient. Jamming fields snapped into existence with such precision that whole wings of Council drones went blind without their mothership links noticing for a fraction too long. Kinetic salvos emerged from concealed launchers hidden in mass that had previously registered as industrial debris. Missile clouds rose not from forts, because there had been no forts, but from cargo clusters, maintenance tugs, and inert-seeming ballast hulks distributed across the system. Council formations trying to pivot toward visible threats found their firing solutions compromised by local geometry the Sarth had shaped years in advance. Every line of retreat crossed ranges somebody had already calculated. Then the human fleet arrived. It came from nowhere that the Council recognized, because the Council had spent centuries imagining military power as something that must announce itself. Human warships emerged from cold anchorages in deep black, from beneath thermal skins wrapped around asteroid fragments, from masked apertures in dwarf planet crust, from slip apertures that opened where no sane planner would have positioned a reserve if one feared only local engagement and not total campaign geometry. There were too many. That was the first true shock. Not their size, though some were enormous. Not their technology, though it was excellent. Numbers. Layer upon layer of hulls in coordinated entry, from fast attack screens to heavy carriers to brutal compact monitors built for close-in-system fighting. The Orion arm had not hidden one fleet. It had hidden the industrial capacity to lose fleets and replace them. Var saw his tactical board fill and understood, perhaps 2 seconds before his officers did, that the expedition was not facing a frontier coalition. It was facing a major power, possibly several. Full-spread defense, he barked. Consolidate on flagship axis. Burn for outer ecliptic. A warning tone cut through him. New contacts, different profile. The Eller had joined the battle. Their ships were harder to identify because many had been present all along as part of infrastructure the Council had scanned and discounted. Habitat spines separated into armored segments. Power reservoirs discharged into field lattices that wrapped the inner defensive volume. Long dormant mirrors unfolded from solar stations and became coherent beam relays. It was as if the whole system had decided that peace was over and remembered what its bones were for. One Council cruiser vanished in a bloom of white where an Eller energy lance sheared through its core shielding. Another survived the hit only to lose propulsion, drifting into a kill box human tactical craft had clearly prepared years before. The Sarth did not arrive in force because they had, in the operational sense, never been absent. Yet now their presence became visible in consequence. Council attempts to regroup met interception at every vector. Drives failed under attack from precisely timed kinetic strikes that hit field nodes as they cycled. Counterflanking maneuvers ran straight into waiting compact groups. The Sarth had known where the expedition would try to go because there are only so many correct responses to disaster if one thinks like a Council-trained admiral. And the Nari, whom most of the expedition had forgotten entirely, reached into the electronic and logistical layers beneath battle. Not crude network collapse, nothing so inelegant. Instead, they fed lies into already confused systems, nudged sensor correlations off by fatal margins, desynchronized supply assumptions, and made every damaged council ship uncertain which distress channels were real. The compliance expedition did not break at once. It was still a formidable force, professionally trained, heavily armed, and led by officers who knew fear but also duty. Council destroyer lines answered with disciplined salvos. Vesk carrier groups launched strike screens that mauled several compact spearheads. Talar command ships stabilized portions of the jamming environment long enough for retreat vectors to be calculated. In one fierce quarter of the battle space, a Dren-heavy battle group cut its way through two human interdiction rings and nearly reached open escape. Then a second wave of human reinforcements translated in behind it, and everyone watching realized the first wave had only been the local response. Var's bridge shook under impacts that rolled through the flagship's armor in nauseating waves. Damage reports stacked faster than triage could process. Forward batteries gone. Port maneuver cluster compromised. Escort Squadron 3 destroyed. 2 carriers mission killed. Multiple formations cut off. He had one final chance, perhaps, to turn this from annihilation into retreat. "Broadcast surrender corridor request," he ordered. Some of his officers stared at him. Others looked relieved. A few looked as if they had just discovered a door in a burning room. "Grand Marshal," his operations chief said, voice raw, "they may not grant it." Var looked at the tactical image where more compact contacts kept appearing from the black, and where the black itself now felt less like space than an enemy that had pretended to be scenery. "They warned us," he said. The request went out. For 6 impossible seconds, battle continued. Then a channel opened. Mara Ellison again, still calm, perhaps a little sadder now. "Grand Marshal Var," she said, "all council units are ordered to cut drives, power down strategic batteries, and hold position. Any vessel continuing offensive action will be engaged. Comply and your surviving ships will be allowed to withdraw under escort beyond compact demarcation. Refuse and you will not leave this system." On the flagship bridge, amid smoke and failing displays, Sejavar understood the full scale of his error. Not just tactical, civilizational. He had come to discipline holdouts. He had found a hidden arm of the galaxy organized, armed, and patient enough to let a great power talk itself into a trap. Var gave the order. Across the broken remains of the expedition, guns went dark one by one. Silence after fleet combat is never complete. There are always reactor whines, cooling screams from stressed hulls, cries on damage control channels, and the endless electronic murmur of systems trying to save what remains alive. But compared to the violence before, the stillness felt absolute. Compact vessels moved among the wreckage with frightening control. Human tugs secured drifting council ships before they could collide. Eller field craft stabilized atmosphere breaches. Nari recovery drones tagged debris fields and rescue priorities. Sarth escorts positioned themselves where any renewed treachery would die instantly. It was the most humiliating thing of all. They were not merely victorious, they were orderly. Var was summoned, not physically but by secure channel, to speak with the same triad that had warned him in the Ilian corridor. Mara Ellison appeared seated now in what looked like an unremarkable operations room. The Eller steward stood beside a transparent display showing casualty streams and salvage assignments. Navigator Marshal Issen was present in profile, as if he disapproved of central framing even in triumph. "You invaded sovereign space," Mara said. "We have disabled your expedition. We will return your survivors and your dead. Your ships will depart without strategic systems online and under escort until you clear our demarcation." Var's shell plating was scorched black in places. He did not bother with dignity. It had no market value here. "Why conceal this?" he asked. "Why spend ages pretending to be less than you are?" The Eller steward answered, because every civilization that rose loudly in the core spent more time defending its reputation than building its future. Mara added, because being left alone was worth more to us than being admired. Var looked from one to the other. The council will not absorb this quietly. No, said Isin, it will absorb it publicly. That was the last conversation of consequence between them. The shattered expedition limped back toward council space under compact escort, then alone. Along the way, every surviving officer wrote reports. Some were defensive, some furious, some almost reverent in their horror. Sensor logs, battle records, structural analyses, and strategic estimates poured into core intelligence repositories. At first, administrators assumed there had been error, misinterpretation, maybe exaggeration born of defeat. Then they cross-correlated the data and discovered that if anything, the survivors had understated what they faced. The Orion arm was not a peripheral backwater. It contained thousands of developed systems under compact coordination. Human population estimates, once revised, dwarfed those of several major council civilizations combined. Industrial output projections became so absurd that committees reran them 3 times and still failed to capture likely hidden reserves. Eller system engineering was found embedded throughout apparently civilian infrastructure at scales the Council had never imagined because no one had looked. Sarth navigational control over outer-arm transit was revealed to be far deeper than any non-Sarth authority had known. Nari systems architecture appeared in everything from freight ledgers to defense masking. Worst of all for the Council's prestige, the Compact had not revealed new impossible weapons. There were no time fractures, no reality edits, no miraculous singularity guns, nothing to reassure the defeated that they had lost to sorcery. They had lost to industry, planning, discipline, concealment, and time. To preparation. The report broke the political order of the Council more thoroughly than any fleet defeat since its founding wars. Independent-minded member states demanded inquiries into the decision to launch the expedition. The Farron, still bitter from occupation, called it proof that central authority had become reckless. Even some loyal blocs were appalled less by the defeat than by the intelligence failure that had sent them blind against a hidden peer power. The Vesk Combine suffered an immediate credibility crisis in military procurement circles. The Taller Administrative School split between factions demanding escalation and factions horrified by what escalation would actually mean now that the asymmetry had reversed. The Dren hierarchy insisted publicly that the Compact's secrecy proved dangerous intent, but the argument landed poorly among species who had just watched the Council arrive uninvited with an enforcement fleet. Markets convulsed, diplomatic missions scrambled. Historical institutes found themselves suddenly fashionable as everyone went digging through records of the old council, trying to understand how the founders had seen all this coming. The answer, annoyingly, was that they had seen it because they helped start the process. In the Orion arm, there was no triumphal parade. That surprised many outside observers. Council media had expected the humans above all to seize the moment to boast, to flood the networks with images of hidden fleets and stern speeches under victorious flags. Instead, the Compact released a concise battle summary, casualty figures on both sides, a statement confirming that surviving expedition personnel had been repatriated, and an archived copy of the pre-battle warning proving the Council had advanced after explicit notice to withdraw. Then they went back to work. Ships returned to their hidden anchorages. Damaged infrastructure was repaired. Freight schedules rerouted around cleanup zones. Habitats resumed ordinary cycles. Civilian schools, markets, and legislatures continued as they had before. To the people of the Compact, this had not been a revelation of who they were. It had been an interruption. Still, some things changed. Compact members argued, as free peoples do after a shock. Humans in particular discovered a fresh appetite for speeches beginning with, "We told them so," while others argued that continued discretion was now impossible and perhaps undesirable. Eller planners urged caution. Sarth strategists assumed with mathematical certainty that every known defense profile was now obsolete because the enemy had seen it once. Nari councils produced horrifyingly comprehensive scenarios for future council behavior, half of which involved escalation through proxies rather than open war. Mara Ellison spent 3 sleepless days moving between coordination chambers on Earth, Luna, and relay nodes beyond Sol before she finally stood before the Compact Coordination Council and said what many were ready to hear. "We are done hiding in order to be ignored," she said. "We are not done being prudent." That became the post-war consensus. The Compact would not seek domination, no matter how many in the Council now suddenly believed it could. It would not march on the core, not because it lacked strength, but because the founders had left the Council precisely to avoid living inside structures addicted to control. But nor would it pretend anymore that the Orion Arm was a sleepy scattering of frontier holdouts. Diplomatic missions expanded. Trade opened more directly. Certain scientific exchanges long kept quiet were announced publicly. Selected maps of compact space were released, enough to establish undeniable scale without surrendering every strategic secret. Universities from neutral states were invited. Delegations from uneasy council members were received with chilly courtesy and excellent tea in the human style. The most watched event in the years after the battle was the reconvening of the old hall. Not the vast modern council chamber with its ranking tiers and procedural arrays, but the original Founders' Hall preserved at the center of the administrative complex like a relic from a more innocent age. Under immense public pressure and after bitter internal struggle, the council agreed to host a constitutional convocation there. Some wanted reform. Others wanted mere symbolism. Most simply wanted to survive the political earthquake. The Compact accepted the invitation, but on terms. No compulsory authority over non-signatories. No enforcement action without unanimous crisis authorization and strict limitation. Restoration of voluntary association principles for member states. Independent review of compliance doctrines. Recognition of compact sovereignty and non-interference rights. A return, in essence, to the truth the first founders had always known, that peace among civilizations is not the same thing as rule over them. Many in the council resisted. Some never yielded at all. But reality, once delivered by shattered fleet hulks and casualty rolls, tends to sharpen philosophical debate. When Mara Ellison entered the old hall beside Eller Steward Tethsen, Sarth Navigator Marshal Issen, and Nari Archivist Cluster 17 of Glass, every camera in council space turned to watch. The human delegation did not arrive draped in medals. The Eller did not wear victory medals of crystal. The Sarth gave no speeches to the press. The Nari merely recorded. They took the same side of the chamber where their ancestors had once sat. There was poetry in that, though humans were the only ones likely to say so aloud. The current council speaker, a cautious neutral from a middling trade federation, invited Mara to address the assembly first. She stood in a hall built before most living civilizations had discovered FTL, in a place designed for argument rather than submission, and let the quiet settle. "We did not come back because you can compel us," she said. "You cannot. We did not come back to humiliate you. You accomplished that yourselves when you sent a fleet into our home after being warned away." A rustle of discomfort moved through the chamber. "We came back," she continued, "because once long ago this council was worth building. It existed so that civilizations could meet as equals, speak plainly, trade freely, and resolve disputes without demanding ownership of one another. Many of you still want that. Some of you may never have known it was possible." Her gaze passed over Talar facets, Vesk armored investments, and the countless delegations beyond them. Humanity was called provincial for living in a spiral arm the core considered unimportant. The Eller were called old. The Sarth were called obscure. The Nari were called marginal. You looked at distance and mistook it for weakness. You looked at quiet and mistook it for emptiness. You looked away while we built futures large enough not to need your approval. No one interrupted. We have no interest in ruling this galaxy. If we did, this conversation would be very different. But understand clearly what has changed. You do not speak to petitioners. You do not negotiate with defectors ashamed to have left. You stand before founding civilizations that remembered what this institution was for when many of you had forgotten. She placed her hands on the old rail before her, the same rail Helen Okonkwo had leaned on in another age. If this hall is once again to be a hall, we will gladly speak here. If it insists on being a throne, we will leave it to those who still imagine thrones are stable things. It was not, in truth, one speech that changed the council. Institutions do not repent because a sentence is well constructed, but the speech became shorthand for a broader shift already underway. Charter scholars dug old provisions from archives. Member states once cowed into silence rediscovered procedural courage. The compliance fleets were pared back, then restructured. Inspection regimes became treaty-based rather than assumed. Some powers seethed, some plotted. The galaxy did not become wise overnight. It did, however, become aware. Awareness mattered. Trade maps were redrawn with the Orion arm, no longer an empty fringe, but a major pole of civilization. Scholars, merchants, and migrants moved outward in numbers that would once have been considered ridiculous. Compact institutions gained prestige that no campaign of self-advertisement could have manufactured. Young species who had grown up hearing of the far-off founders, as relics learned instead that patience can be a kind of strength larger and stranger than conquest. As for the people of Earth and the wider human worlds, they reacted to their new visibility with the same contradictory energy they applied to everything. Some reveled in the vindication. Some resented the attention. Some turned the whole affair into theater, novels, songs, and tasteless dramatic serials in which Grand Marshal Var was portrayed by actors too handsome to be plausible. More serious minds reviewed centuries of policy and concluded that discretion had served them brilliantly right up until it no longer could. Shipbuilding budgets quietly increased anyway. On a hillside above one of Earth's old oceans, where wind moved through restored grass and the orbital lanes shone faintly at dusk, Mara Ellison met with an Eller friend not long after the convocation concluded. The crisis was over, insofar as any crisis involving civilizations can ever be over. The council had bent. The galaxy had learned. The compact remained whole. "Do you regret it?" Mara asked. The Eller Tethsen looked up at a sky crowded with invisible traffic and visible stars. "Leaving? No. Hiding?" Teth considered. "We did not hide. We refrained from announcing ourselves to people who had not earned the privilege of understanding us." Mara laughed softly. "That is the most Eller answer possible." "It is also true." Below them, the sea rolled in silver bands toward a shore where children from 3 species ran under the same evening light. Somewhere far above, cargo moved from Luna toward the outer fleet reservoirs. Beyond that, across the arm and its uncounted worlds, habitats spun, fields ripened, furnaces burned, and watch stations listened. The galaxy knew now. Or thought it did. That was enough for one age. In the Council's earliest days, the core species had believed the Orion arm to be thin, poor, and provincial. A place of hicks, as a human historian later rendered one elder phrase with wicked delight. They had seen distance from the core and assumed distance from significance. They had mistaken their maps for reality. Humanity had let them. The Eller had let them. The Sarth and the Nari had let them. And while the galaxy argued, regulated, centralized, moralized, and watched itself in mirrors polished by its own importance, the quiet civilizations in the Forgotten Arm had built ship by ship, world by world, century by century. Not in secret exactly. just without asking to be noticed. That was the lesson the Council learned too late, and the rest of the galaxy learned just in time. The powerful are not always the loudest. The old are not always fatting. The distant are not always weak. And the species that seems content to be left alone may, if pushed hard enough, reveal that solitude was never its shield. It was its choice.